So today we're going to cover a couple of topics, and the first one is going to be looking at the Scenario Manager feature within PTV Vissim. And as a part of this, we're going to take a look at a few different use cases for using this feature, and then go through some of the related components. So we're going to take a look at what the base network is, and then what are modifications and scenarios. And then finally, we're going to take a look at some best practices so that you can use scenario management to its kind of fullest extent. All right, so first of all, what exactly is scenario management? So when a file is using Scenario Manager, what you can essentially do is create different variations of one network and keep all of those changes within a single file. So for example, you maybe have, you want to model like an AMP and a PMP, but you want to use the same network geometry. This will allow you to keep all of that data in one file rather than having a separate AM peak and a separate PM peak file. And Scenario Manager also has a feature that allows you to quickly compare networks and see how some of those attribute values compare with one another. And this is particularly useful when you're trying to compare any simulation results. So in addition to modeling these various times of day, you can also use Scenario Manager to model some different demand years. So maybe you have an existing case and a future year case. You can also look at various geometry changes, such as new interchange design, maybe different intersection control types. So maybe you have a stop-controlled intersection, and maybe you want to look at changing that to a signalized intersection or a roundabout. Or you can also use it to model different transit options. So maybe you want to add in and see what maybe a BRT looks like. Or maybe you want to take an existing transit network and maybe see what the impact is if those stop locations change. And so with the use of Scenario Manager, you can really build up many different types of network changes, and then you can easily combine them depending on what you're looking to model. So Scenario Manager has a few different components, and the first is going to be that base network. And the base network is going to contain all of that basic geometry that's in the network and include any changes that you made to calibrate the model. So then once you have the base network created, that's typically when you'd go ahead and place the model under scenario management. And then from there, you can start making some changes to the base network. And all of those changes are going to be held within some modification files. And so a modification could be something like if you had an AM demand, or maybe that modification for a new geometry configuration. These modifications can then be combined on top of the base network, and those are going to be what creates those scenarios. And the modifications can be mixed and matched, so you can create a variety of scenarios, all depending on which cases you're looking to model. Oh, one other nice thing about the having that base network is that you can go back and you can make any changes at any time. And any change you make to the base network will carry through to your modifications and to your scenarios. So it removes the need for you having to update multiple files. If you had, maybe an AM peak file and a PM peak file, the changes can be just done once, and it will just carry through to everything. This can be useful if you have to edit maybe an existing network object, so maybe you need to go back and maybe change some of your change of speed decision, or if you need to even add new objects, which is really useful, especially when you're doing some starting to put in those evaluation objects. If you realize, oh, I'd really like to measure the travel time for this particular segment, you can always go back to the base network, add that travel time segment in place, and that's going to carry through to everything. And then one other thing to note is that the base network itself cannot actually be run. So all the simulations have to be done within a scenario. So if you do want to run the base network on its own, you'll just need to create a scenario that doesn't have any modifications, that's just that base network on its own. All right, so in order to start using Scenario Manager, first you'll just need to go up to the File option, and then you can go down to Scenario Management, and then select Place under Scenario Management. And as soon as you do that, it's going to open up the window here on the right, and this will allow you to enter in a name for the project, and you can also choose a name for the first scenario at this point. And then as soon as you click OK, what's going to happen is that IMPX file is going to turn into a scenario management file. and a few different items are going to be generated. So first, within the directory itself, wherever you have that INPX file stored, you're going to see some other folders that are going to be created here. So you'll see a backup and a temp folder, which will be used internally by Vissim. And then you'll also see some folders, one for modifications, which are going to contain all of those modification files, and then one for scenarios, which is going to contain all of the results for any of those scenarios that you've created. And in addition to these folders, there's also going to be a database file that's created. So you'll see here we've got this Vissim PTV file. And so this is really going to contain all the information and descriptions about these modifications and the scenarios, and also contain information about which modifications are included in all of the scenarios. And we recommend just making sure that all of those folders kind of stay intact. So just make sure that you just keep them where they're located and don't delete any of those folders in order to prevent any data loss when you're working with scenario management. And in addition to the external files, you'll also see within Vissim itself, once you place it under scenario management, you'll get this new Project Explorer window that will pop up where that network objects toolbar normally is. And this is where you can see information about the base network, and then you'll also see a list of all the scenarios and modifications in there as well. And so this Project Explorer has its own toolbar, and this can be used to, it really contains some quick keys that you can use whenever you're building up or running scenarios. So the first button here is going to open up the project structure, and this will allow you to edit the project space settings and the properties of both modifications and scenarios. And we're going to talk more about this in detail in a few minutes. You can also use that folder icon to open up whichever option is selected, so whether it be the base network, a scenario, or a modification. You can also assign any modifications to a selected scenario with that little save icon. You can use the plus icon to add any new scenarios or modifications. Or similarly, you can duplicate them or choose to delete them as well. And then the last three options here deal with running the simulations and scenario management. So the first icon here, the single play button, is going to simulate the highlighted scenario only, whereas if you have that double play button selected, that's going to simulate all of the scenarios one after the other. And so this multi-run feature is really useful once you kind of have everything set up and you're ready to run maybe a batch of runs. You want to run maybe multiple scenarios, all having multiple seeds. And so this multi-run feature will allow the scenarios to just automatically run one after the other. So you can kind of hit play and let that run in the background until it completes. And then finally, there also is a cancel button if you realize you need to restart any of the simulations or just close out of that and then make some changes and rerun. So that cancel button will close all of those scenario runs that are in place. All right, so now we're going to go back to that first button that we talked about, which opens up the project structure. And so the project structure here is its own separate window. And this will allow you to edit the project space settings and then also edit properties for those scenarios and modifications. And so you'll see here within this window itself, we've got three different tabs here. So we're going to start with the basic settings tab. And this will contain information about the project name. So that's the name that you can set up initially when you place it under scenario management. And then it also contains a log. And so this log will contain some automatic entries that are going to be added whenever you create new scenarios or modifications, or if you ever duplicate or delete anything. This will automatically date those and then just put in an entry for that particular log. You can also manually add any of these log files if you press that plus button here. So this practice can be useful, especially if you're working on a project with other people, just if you want to keep track of notes or make track of any changes that you've done, so that way other people can also see it and just see what's being changed within this file. All right, so next we're going to move over to the Modification tab on the end. And this contains a list of all the modifications, again, which are just really a set of changes made to the base network. So this is where you could create different demand modifications, if you had any geometry updates, or even if you have different signal timing plans. So the modification window contains a few different columns that we wanted to just go through here. So the first option here is the load index, and this really determines what order each modification is going to be loaded into a scenario. And by default, this is just going to be consecutive numbering based on how those modifications, or when those modifications are created. And then there's also a name and description, and both of these are used to contain details about the modifications. So it's really highly recommended that you update these with as much information as possible, just so it's clear which modification contains which changes, just so that you can easily select the appropriate modifications once you move into the scenario tab. And the group column here is just a string that you can use to categorize the modifications. So this is mainly used for sorting purposes, especially when you have a lot of modifications in here, just so that you can easily find things within the same group. So you can really name these whatever you want. And then if you do want to sort any of these columns, you can just click on the header, and that's going to sort that by that group column. And then next up, we have the list of exclusions. And this is going to be set based on which modifications you don't want to be combined within the same scenario. So for example, if you have maybe like a couple of demand modifications, like here we have an AM and a PM, and then we also have an AM and a PM signal timing plan. So for these, you probably don't want those demand modifications to be used together. So in this case, we've set modification number 1 to exclude 2, and then we've set modification number 2 to exclude 1, just so that this will prevent us accidentally adding both of these to one scenario, which would then cause the data to be overwritten based on how it's loaded. So in this case, if you did add 1 and 2 to the same scenario, what's going to happen is that modification 1 will get loaded, and then 2 will be loaded on top of it and overwrite all of those AM changes. So adding in these modifications can be really helpful, just to make sure that you don't overwrite any of that data that you're trying to use for a particular scenario. And then finally, we have a list of dependencies, and this is kind of opposite to the exclusion. In this case, this will be any modifications that you want to be used together. So for example, you may have a new geometry addition. So in this case, we have an example here for like a geometry for a railroad addition. And then from here, you may have other modifications that you want to depend on that geometry addition. So in this case, we've got, we're adding in some of the actual train vehicles to the network. So both of these depend on modification number 5 here. And so again, this is really useful, especially when you have any new geometry addition where you can put the geometry in one modification, and then anything else, like maybe a new signal timing or new intersection objects, you can place those in a separate modification and then just have those depend on that other modification. And whenever you set up these dependencies, whenever you do that, it'll always ensure that this dependent modification will be loaded first. So in this case, if you ever open up modification number 6, it's going to go ahead and load modification number 5 first, and then load in number 6. And then along the right-hand side here, we have a toolbar, which is, you'll see it's pretty similar to that Project Explorer toolbar, but this can just be more convenient when you're working directly within this modification window. So in here, you can do all the similar actions. So you can add new modifications, duplicate those modifications, and delete modifications. And then you can also move the modifications around. And essentially what this will do is, if you click on any of these and you kind of shift that order, it's going to change this load index number here so that the modifications will be loaded in a different sequence. And then you can also highlight a couple of modifications if you want to check, perform a couple of checks here, which are the next 2 options. So the first one here is going to check and see whether two of those modifications can be used in the scenario together. So it's really just going to look at that exclusion list and see if those two are compatible and can be loaded together. And it's going to just show up a little pop-up window that's going to tell you whether or not those two can be used together within the scenario. And then kind of on the flip side, you can also check to see if two modifications have any dependencies that may result in different networks being created based on their loading order. And so for either one of these options, these are just still useful when you have a lot of modifications or if you have a really long string here of different dependencies or exclusions. So this is just a quick way to check both of those to see if there's any exclusions or dependencies. And then finally here, you can also use the little wrench icon if you wanted to add any other modification attributes or if you wanted to change the order of the columns here that are being displayed. All right, so now we're going to go back to the middle here of our project structure window, and we're going to take a look at the scenario tab. So the scenarios are really just a group of modification files. And again, these can all be applied, these modification files will all be applied to the base network, and then the scenarios from there can then be run and then analyzed. So like modifications, scenarios also have both a name and a description. And then scenarios have a modification column here. And whenever you select on this, this will allow you to check which modifications should be used within that particular scenario. And then finally, there is also that comparison option. And this will allow you to select any other scenarios that you'd ever want to compare to that particular scenario. And basically what the scenario comparison does is if you, say we have AM being compared to PM, you can then open up the AM scenario, and then you can open up any attribute or any object list and view any attributes and kind of see how some of those attribute values compare. Again, this is really useful whenever you're looking at maybe some evaluation results, and maybe you wanted to see how some different travel times compare. You can definitely use this this feature to quickly compare some of those values between scenarios. And then over on the right in the scenario toolbar, this is where you can add new scenarios directly within this window. Again, you can also duplicate or delete any scenarios. And then scenarios also have an option to be exported to a separate INTX file. So if you ever have maybe a huge scenario management file and maybe you want to take a particular scenario and then need to do a separate study or do some additional changes, and you kind of want to start from one of those other scenarios, you can always use this button to export the scenario, and it'll just become its own separate INTX file that you can then use from there. And then finally, you can also use the little wrench icon, again, to add any other attributes or change the display of the columns within this window. Okay, so now that we've gone through the project structure window and we've covered kind of all those components of Scenario Manager, now we're going to go back to the main network window, and we're going to see how we can open up and edit any of these. So if we go back and take a look at opening or editing that base network, you can always access this either by double-clicking on the base network itself, so that'll always be the top option here, or you can also just right-click on base network and select open. And as soon as you do that, it'll open up the base network, and it's going to have the title base network up here at the top, and then all of the window frames are going to be shown in olive green. So the kind of the window frame coloring is always a good indication to see kind of what's open if you have a base network open or a scenario or a modification. And once you have that base network open, from here you can just edit like you normally would in any separate INTX file. You can make any changes in here, add or delete any objects. And then whenever you're done, you can just hit the Save button up at the top. And again, any changes that you make here in the base network, these are going to trickle through to your modifications and the scenarios. And then if you want to open up a modification, you can, just like the base network, you can either double click on that particular modification, or you can right click and select open. And in this case, for the modification, the window frames are all going to be in this dark maroon color. And then up at the top, you'll also see here the name of the modification will show up as well. And then just like the base network, in the modification, you can make any changes, and then you can just select save whenever you're complete with that. And then finally, if you want to open up any scenario, again, you can just double click on that scenario, or you can right click and select open. One other nice thing about the scenarios is that each of them are going to have a little plus button next to them. And you can always click those to kind of expand which modifications are within that scenario. So if you ever just want to quickly double check and see what kind of is included in the scenario, you can always select that plus button just to see what all is included there. And then once you have a scenario open, again, the title bar is going to change based on that scenario number and name. And then in this case, all of the frames are going to be shown in green. And then in order to run any scenario, you can just click the play button up at the top like you normally would for any standalone network file, or you can also use that scenario play button as well. All right, so that really covers all of the features of scenario management. So we also just wanted to go through a few of the best practices whenever you're using this feature. So first off, we recommend making any edits to the modification files directly. So instead of opening up a scenario and then making edits, we would recommend doing that directly in the modification file. And what can happen if you do open up a scenario and start to make changes is that Vissim will start to automatically generate some of these modification files. So you'll see here that you'll see some of these generated automatically tags that will appear. And this can happen as you're making changes directly within the scenario and then saving that scenario. And this can make it really difficult to track what changes are actually included in each of these and makes it really difficult to reuse these modifications within multiple scenarios. So in order to prevent this, just make sure that whenever you're making any edits, you're within that modification file itself or within that base network. And one other thing, if you are in a scenario and are accidentally starting to make some changes, this pop-up window will come up whenever you go to play or save that scenario. And it's just going to say this, the loaded scenario has changed. So this is also a good indication that maybe you're making changes in the scenario itself. But if you ever see this, you can just click no on this, and then you can go back into the appropriate modification, or you can create a new modification and then start working from there to make the changes. It's also really helpful to update all of the names and the descriptions for the modifications and scenarios, just so that anyone else working on the file can easily see what's included. And it's an easier way just to keep track of what changes are being made in which modification file. And then if a modification does not have a name, you'll see some of these here. These will just show up with a number, which is also not super helpful whenever you're trying to kind of figure out what changes are being made in this. So updating those names and descriptions is another good practice. And then if you set up all of those dependencies and exclusions within that modification window, that's always a good first step before creating those scenarios, just to make sure that modifications with similar data are not going to be combined, which can lead to that data being overwritten. And then one other thing we haven't talked about yet is that if you are modeling maybe some different signal timing, so maybe you have a modification file for AM timing and a PM timing, for these you'll need to create separate controller files just to make sure that they have a separate reference in order to store that data. So if you do have like an RBC file, you'll probably want to create like an RBC AM file and an RBC PM file just to make sure that those modification files have different references to store that separate data. And then last but not least, also remember to take advantage of that multi-run feature, especially if you want to run something overnight, and then you can kind of see what all of those results look like once that whole batch of runs is complete. All right, so before we go over to the example file, just wanted to give you a quick overview of kind of the layout of this file. So we have here our base network, the same one that we've been using for the last couple of months. And then we're going to look at creating a few different modifications. So we've got one for a demand update, which will include an AM modification and a PM modification. And then a couple of signal updates, again, one for AM and one for PM. And then we've got a geometry update, which just adds some of the railroad geometry going through this network. And then we also have the addition of the actual trains themselves on this new geometry. And so because of that, this train addition is going to depend on this geometry addition. And then from there, we're going to use all of these modifications to then create a couple of scenarios, one for AM peak and then one for PM peak. All right, so here we have our base network example file. And again, if you want to place any of your files under scenario management, that's all going to be done under File, Scenario Management, and then placed under Scenario Management. And again, as soon as you do that, it's going to open up the Project Explorer window here, which you'll see is on that kind of dock to that same pane here where that network object toolbar is. So if you ever are making edits, you can use these buttons down here at the bottom to switch between the Project Explorer and the network object. And then again, as soon as you do place that file under Scenario Management, you will see some of those other files and folders that are created within that same directory. And so you'll see here, if we look inside some of these, like the modification folder, this contains all of those modification files that we're adding. And then similarly, for any of the scenarios, you'll see those also have their own folder. And each of these are going to contain the results from any of those scenario runs. So if we take a look at the project structure here, first I'll go over to the Modification tab. And so again, here's where we've filled out kind of some of those name and descriptions, and then we've set up those exclusions and dependencies that we talked about. So anything that's AM or PM time of day specific, we set those up to exclude one another. And you'll see here, if you click on any of those drop downs, it'll let you, it's just a checkbox selection that you can choose to set some of those exclusions or dependencies. And then in this case, we've just got a couple of modifications here, numbers 6 and 7, that are going to have a dependency. So again, both of these are just adding on trains in the form of PT lines. And this is just going to use that railroad geometry. So in this case, we've got this set to depend on modification number 5. And then within the scenarios themselves, we have a couple of options here, one for AM peak and one for PM peak. And if I select on those modifications, again, this is where you can add which modifications you want to be included in that scenario. And so in this case, we've got the AM traffic and the AM signal timing. And then we also have that AM train schedule. And this is where setting up those dependencies is really useful. In this case, you can just choose, like in this case, I've just have that train schedule AM selected. But since we have that dependency set up, it's actually going to also load 5 automatically. So you can see here we've got modifications being loaded. We've got 1, 3, 5, and 6. So that's another nice thing about having those dependencies set up, is if you select one of the modifications, the other one will be automatically loaded. And then just like AM, we also have the PM set up, just referencing those PM modification files. And if I select any of those modifications, I'll just double click on any of those to load those up. So all of the traffic options, those are really just changing the vehicle input volume, and then also changing those static route relative flow values. So if you look in here, these relative flow values are being updated from the base network. And same thing for PM, those are just going to have some other options here for relative flow values and for the vehicle input. And then on the signal timing side, we have, again, one option for AM. So if I open up the signal controllers here, you'll see these are, again, where we have set up some separate RBC files here, one for AM, and then PM, we also have a separate PM file set up. And again, this is just to make sure that none of that data gets overwritten. So for example, if we just had the same file being referenced for both of these, in that case, making any edits within this RBC window, these would actually just overwrite that same file. So it is important to make sure that you've got those separate named references for any signal timing updates. And then finally, we have that geometry addition. So if I load up this one here, you'll see we've got, in this case, we've got a new railroad line that we added in here. And this geometry here for the railroad does include the railroad line itself. And then we also have a railroad crossing signal controller that's been added down here as well. And then from here, we've got, again, those two different schedules we've got in order to add that train actually onto the network. So if I double click on the AM one, what this will do is since there's that dependency, it's going to actually load number 5 first, and then we'll load number 6. And in this case, we're using the public transport lines, which I know we haven't talked about yet. But in this case, we've just got a transit line set up here with some departure time set up in here. And then one for AM and one for PM. Just to edit that in here. So then if you do want to run any of those scenarios, again, you can just double click on any of those options, and that's just going to go through and load those modifications depending on that load index that's been set. And then from here, again, you can just play a simulation like you normally would, just for any standalone file. And again, here, my project explorer is a little bit small, but if you expand that out, here's where you can always run that multi-run feature if you wanted to kind of select a couple and run there. And so let me show you that too real quick. So in order to do that multi-run, you can just click that double play button. And you'll see here that there'll be a couple of icons when you are doing that multi-run. It'll show you kind of the hourglass symbol if that is waiting. And then it'll have a play icon for any scenarios that are currently running. And then you can also always cancel that simulation run as well. And then those are just going to have that you circle with the line through it, and if any of those scenarios got canceled. All right, so that kind of covers all of the features again of scenario management in just this small example file. So hopefully this will help you, especially when you are doing any sort of modeling where you've got a lot of different variations or maybe different changes that you want to do. And this is just a nice way to keep everything all in the same file and kind of keep everything combined.